Good evening. You've found a quiet place, a space where nothing urgent is happening, where there's nothing you need to figure out or hold on to. This is the Observer's Journal, a collection of small observations gathered slowly, offered without expectation, things noticed in passing, moments that unfolded quietly and then moved on. There's no particular reason for any of it, no lesson waiting at the end, just the soft rhythm of one thing and then another after that. Tonight's entry is about distance, not the kind measured in miles, but the kind that exists between where you are and where your attention has been, the kind that appears when you stop moving for a moment and simply notice what's already here. There's no need to listen closely, no detail you'll be asked to recall. This is simply something to rest alongside, a voice in the background, a gentle current you can follow or drift away from, whichever feels easier. You're welcome to close your eyes now, or keep them soft and unfocused. You're welcome to shift your position, to settle more deeply into wherever you are. There's nothing you need to do with your hands, your thoughts, your breathing. Everything can be exactly as it is. The journal continues at its own pace, regardless of whether you're following each word. It moves slowly enough that nothing will be missed if your attention wanders. It asks nothing of you, so let yourself be still. Let the day begin to fall away, not all at once, but gradually, the way light fades from a room when no one is watching. There's a small town, not far from here, or perhaps very far, it doesn't matter, where the streets curve in ways that no longer make sense. They were laid down long ago, following paths that animals took, or the contours of land that has since been built over and forgotten. If you walk through that town in the early evening, just as the sky is losing its color, you'll notice how the light lingers differently on certain corners, how some doorways seem to hold the day a little longer, while others have already surrendered to shadow. No one who lives there thinks about this. They move through the streets without seeing them, the way you move through any familiar place, by memory, by habit, by the body's quiet understanding of where things are. But if you were passing through, if you had no particular destination, you might notice. There was a time when night arrived without warning. It was coming. No switch to dim, no lamp to leave burning, just the slow withdrawal of light from the sky, the way water drains from sand. People gathered close to the fire then, not because they had decided to, but because fire was the only warmth that remained once the sun had gone. They sat near enough to feel its heat on their faces, far enough that the smoke didn't sting their eyes. The flames moved constantly, throwing shadows that stretched and shifted across stone, across skin, across the openings of caves and simple shelters. The fire made a small circle of visibility. Beyond it, darkness collected in layers, close darkness, where you could still make out shapes, and then deeper darkness, where nothing could be seen at all. The world contracted at night. What had been wide and open during the day became intimate, bounded by how far the light could reach. They did not fight this contraction, they moved inward with it. Around the fire, there were sounds, quiet voices sometimes, the crack of wood giving itself to flame, the shuffle of bodies arranging themselves on ground softened with grass or hides or nothing at all. Children settled against adults. Adults leaned into one another. Warmth was shared the way air is shared, without ceremony, without thought. The fire burned lower as time passed. No one measured this time. There were no hours then, no increments by which the night could be divided. There was only the quality of darkness, the temperature of air, the heaviness that began to settle into limbs and eyelids. Sleep came unevenly. It did not arrive all at once, the way we imagine it now, a single descent into unconsciousness. It came in waves, in stages. Someone closed their eyes while others still gazed into the coals. A child slept, woke, slept again. An adult drifted off, then stirred when the fire needed tending, rose quietly, added wood, and returned to rest. The night was long, longer than we know nights to be now. 12 hours, sometimes more, stretched between dusk and dawn in the seasons when darkness dominated. And so sleep unfolded across that span, in a rhythm that had no name, no structure, only the gentle pulse of waking and sleeping and waking again. There was no urgency to any of it. If you woke in the deepest part of the night, you simply lay still. You watched the embers breathe their faint orange glow. You listened to the night sounds, wind moving through grass, the distant call of something unseen, the breathing of those beside you. You did not worry that you were awake. You did not count the hours until morning. You simply existed in the quiet. And when sleep returned, you welcomed it without effort. Sometimes people spoke in these wakeful interludes, soft words exchanged in darkness, a question about the day just past, a murmur of reassurance. Mostly, though, there was silence, the kind of silence that feels inhabited, that holds presence without requiring speech. Above them, if the sky was clear, stars filled the dome of night. In numbers we can hardly imagine now, thousands of points of light, unwavering, cold, indifferent. They had always been there. They would always be there. This was understood without needing to be said. The stars did not tell time exactly, but they marked it. They moved across the sky in their slow procession, and those who watched them, who had watched them all their lives, as their parents had, as their parents' parents had, knew what their positions meant. When certain stars appeared at certain places, seasons changed, animals moved, plants emerged or withered. But at night, lying under that vast scatter of light, such knowledge receded. The stars were simply there, distant and constant, a ceiling that never lowered. never closed in. The moon, when it was present, changed everything. On nights when it rose full and bright, the world did not disappear entirely after sunset. Shapes remained visible, the line of hills against sky, the pale trunks of trees, the contours of familiar ground. People moved more easily on such nights. They could see one another's faces faintly. They could navigate short distances without stumbling. But the moon was not always full. Often it was a sliver or absent altogether, and on those nights the darkness was complete. It pressed close. It filled every space. People stayed near the fire, near one another, and did not wander. They trusted the darkness in their way. It was not an enemy. It was simply the other half of the world, the half that belonged to rest, to stillness, to the quiet turning of the body inward. In winter, nights stretched even longer. The cold kept people close, huddled together under whatever coverings they had fashioned. Animal skins, woven grasses, layers of their own warmth. Sleep became deeper then, heavier. The body conserved itself. There was less to do, less reason to wake. The fire was tended less frequently. The darkness was allowed to settle more fully. In summer, nights were brief and sleep was lighter. People woke with the first suggestion of dawn when the sky began to pale at the edges. But even then, even in the shortest nights, there was time for rest to arrive in its own way, without hurry, without resistance. No one decided when to sleep. The body knew. When darkness came, and the day's movement stilled, and the fire burned low, heaviness arrived. Eyelids closed, breath slowed. The mind, which had been occupied with the tasks of survival, finding food, avoiding danger, moving through the world, released its grip. Thoughts drifted, became fragmented, dissolved into something that was not quite thought anymore. And sleep, when it came, was deep in a way that required no effort. It was the body's natural collapse into rest after a day of physical work. Muscles that had walked, carried, dug, climbed, all let go at once. There was no tension held in the jaw, the shoulders, the hands. There was nothing left to hold. Dreams came, surely. Though no record of them remains, we know they must have come. The mind does not stop when the body sleeps. It continues its work in another register, sorting through the day's images, the day's fears, the day's small triumphs. Perhaps they dreamed of animals they had seen, of landscapes they had crossed, of people no longer present, of hunger, of safety, of the things that occupied their waking hours. But dreams were not discussed the way we discuss them now. They were private, interior, fleeting. They dissolved upon waking, leaving only faint traces, a feeling, an image half remembered, a sense of something just beyond reach. The night held all of this without judgment, without meaning. It simply was, and people moved through it as they had always moved through it, generation after generation, their sleep shaped by darkness, by firelight, by the rhythms their bodies carried within them. No one thought of sleep as something to optimize, to improve, to measure. It was as fundamental as breathing. You did not question it. You did not resist it. When your body needed rest, you rested. When it was time to wake, you woke. And if the night was long, and sleep came and went in stages, this was not a problem. This was simply how night unfolded. Over time, people began to gather in larger numbers. Small groups became clusters. Clusters became something more permanent. They built structures that lasted through seasons, through years. Walls of stone, of mud, of wood, roofs that kept out rain and held in warmth. They learned to grow food instead of only searching for it. They domesticated animals. They created vessels to hold water, fire, grain. They wove cloth and shaped metal and marked time by the sun's movement, by the moon's phases, by the turn of seasons they had always observed but now began to name. And still, night came. Still, darkness gathered. Still, people slept when their bodies grew heavy and woke when the first light touched the horizon. But something was beginning to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new relationship with time, with space, with the rhythms that had governed life since the beginning. Settlements grew along rivers, in valleys, on plains where the earth was soft enough to till. And in these places, as people built and planted and stored and planned, the night began to hold different possibilities. In the first cities, night still belonged to darkness. Streets that had been filled with movement during the day, merchants calling out, animals being led to market, children running between buildings, grew silent as the sun descended. People returned to their homes, to the small spaces they had built from clay, from stone, from whatever the earth around them offered. These were not large homes. Most were single rooms, sometimes two, walls thick enough to hold back heat in summer and cold in winter, floors of packed earth or simple tile, a doorway covered with fabric or wood, a window, perhaps, though not always. And if there was a window, it was small, practical, a way to let smoke escape or air move through. Inside, the light changed as the day ended. Sunlight withdrew gradually, retreating from walls, from corners, leaving only the dimness that comes just before true dark. And in that dimness, people lit lamps, small vessels of clay shaped by hand, a reservoir for oil, olive oil, most often, or oil pressed from seeds, from whatever grew abundantly enough to be spared for burning, a wick of twisted fiber, linen or cotton, resting in the oil, one end submerged, the other exposed. And when flame touched the wick, Light bloomed, not bright light, not the kind that fills a room or pushes back shadows completely, just a small, flickering presence, a glow that made faces visible, that allowed hands to continue their work a little longer, that kept the darkness from becoming absolute. The flame moved constantly. It bent with the air, with breath, with the subtle currents that flowed through any inhabited space. And it threw shadows that were never still, shadows that stretched and contracted, that shifted across walls in slow, rhythmic patterns. People grew accustomed to this. They did not need full visibility. They knew where things were. They moved through their homes by touch as much as by sight, their hands finding what they needed without thought. The lamp burned as long as there was oil, sometimes through the entire night, if oil could be spared. More often, it was allowed to burn low and then extinguish itself once the household had settled into sleep. Families slept together, not always by choice, but because space was limited and warmth was necessary. In cooler months, especially, bodies huddled close, parents, children, sometimes extended family, all sharing the same room, the same floor, the same woven mats, or simple mattresses stuffed with straw or wool. There was no privacy in the way we understand it now. Sleep was communal. You fell asleep to the sound of others breathing. You woke to their stirring. If someone rose in the night, everyone knew. If a child cried, the whole household heard. But this was not considered intrusive. This was simply how night unfolded. In warmer climates, in cities built near rivers, or along coastlines where the air stayed mild, even after dark, people sometimes slept on rooftops, flat roofs made of wood and clay, strong enough to hold weight, open to the sky. They carried their mats up narrow stairs, spread them across the roof's surface, and lay down under the stars. The air was cooler there. Breezes moved more freely, and the sounds of the city, distant voices, animals settling, the occasional footstep on stone, rose up from below, softened by height and darkness. Children fell asleep quickly on those rooftops, lulled by the openness, by the sense of being suspended between earth and sky. Adults lingered a little longer, gazing upward, watching stars emerge one by one as the last light faded. In winter, or in places where cold descended sharply after sunset, rooftops were abandoned. Everyone retreated indoors. Doors were closed, sealed with cloth or wood to keep warmth from escaping. And if there was a brazier, a small metal bowl filled with coals, it was placed in the center of the room, radiating heat that barely reached the walls, but made the air less bitter, less harsh. People slept close to these braziers when they could, not so close that sparks or heat became dangerous, but near enough to feel the difference. The glow of embers provided just enough light to see by, a faint orange wash that made shapes visible without defining them clearly. The coals needed tending. Someone always woke in the deepest part of night to add more fuel, to stir what remained, to coax the fire back into steadiness. This was not as seen as an interruption. It was part of the night's rhythm. You woke, you tended the fire, you returned to sleep. The household continued its slow breathing around you. Outside, the city rested. Streets emptied almost completely once full darkness arrived. There were no streetlights, no lanterns hung at intervals to guide the way. If you needed to move through the city at night, you carried your own lamp, a small clay vessel cupped in your hand, its flame protected from wind by the curve of your palm. But most people did not move through the city at night. There was no reason to. Work had ended, shops had closed. The marketplace, which had been crowded and loud during the day, was now silent, empty, swept clean. Guards walked the streets in some cities, men assigned to watch for fire, for theft, for anything that disrupted the peace. They moved slowly, their footsteps deliberate, their presence more symbolic than active. Mostly, they encountered no one. Occasionally, a door opened. Someone stepped out briefly to relieve themselves in the street, as was common, or to check on an animal, or to stand for a moment in the cooler air before returning inside. These interruptions were brief. The night was not a time for lingering outdoors. In temples, in the centers of cities where gods were honored with stone and ritual, priests kept vigils. They tended eternal flames, fires that were not allowed to go out, that represented continuity, divine presence, the unbroken thread between day and night, between the mortal and the sacred. These flames burned in enclosed spaces, in inner chambers where only the ordained could enter, but their light sometimes spilled out through doorways, through high windows, casting faint glows that marked the temple's location even in complete darkness. People knew these lights were there. They took comfort in them, perhaps, or simply accepted them as part of the city's landscape, as permanent as the stones beneath their feet. In villages, in smaller settlements beyond the great cities, night was quieter still. Homes were more dispersed. Fields stretched between them. Trees rose up in clusters, dark shapes against a sky that seemed wider, less interrupted by human construction. Here, the sounds of night were different. No murmur of distant crowds, no echo of footsteps on stone. Instead, there were animal sounds, dogs barking at shadows, cattle shifting in their pens, insects singing in the grasses. Wind moved more freely, unbroken by walls, carrying with it the scent of earth, of crops, of wood smoke from dying fires. Village homes were simpler than city dwellings, smaller, built with less permanence. Walls of woven reeds plastered with mud, roofs of thatch, floors that were sometimes nothing more than packed dirt, smoothed by years of footsteps. Inside, the rituals of night were much the same. A lamp, if oil could be afforded. More often, just the embers of the cooking fire, banked carefully so they would not go out completely, so they could be revived in the morning without needing to create flame anew. Families gathered around these embers. They spoke quietly, if they spoke at all. Mostly, they prepared for sleep in silence, unrolling mats, arranging blankets, settling children, checking that the door was secure. Sleep came earlier in villages. There was less to stay awake for, no markets to linger in, no neighbors crowded close enough to visit easily, just the rhythms of farm work, which began at dawn and required rest to sustain. And so people slept deeply, their bodies exhausted from physical labor, their minds unburdened by the complexities of city life. They woke when the first birds called, when the sky began to lighten, when the day's work demanded their presence once more. In both cities and villages, in grand homes and simple huts, certain truths remained constant. Night was dark, truly dark, in a way that required adjustment, that asked the eyes to soften and accept limitation. Firelight and lamplight were precious, rationed, never taken for granted. Sleep was shared. Privacy was rare. The sounds of others, their breathing, their movements, their occasional words, were woven into the fabric of rest. And time moved differently at night, without clocks, without any way to measure the hours precisely. People relied on internal rhythms, on the body's sense of when enough rest had been taken, on the gradual return of light to signal morning's arrival. No one worried about sleep in the way we worry now. There was no concept of insomnia as a condition, no belief that sleep should arrive instantly and last unbroken until dawn. If you woke in the night, you simply lay still. You listened to the darkness. You waited for sleep to return, and it did, eventually, without force. In wealthier homes, in the houses of merchants or officials, or those who had accumulated more than others, there were additional comforts. Mattresses stuffed more fully with finer materials, blankets woven from softer wool, rooms designated specifically for sleep, separate from the spaces used for cooking or work. But even in these homes, darkness was still darkness. Lamps still flickered. Night still imposed its limitations. And even the wealthiest slept in ways we would find unfamiliar. They woke and slept in cycles. They shared their sleeping spaces with family, with servants, with those whose presence was expected, normal, unremarkable. Slaves in households where slavery existed slept in corners, on floors, in spaces not designated as rooms, but simply as the places where they were allowed to rest. Their sleep was lighter, more fragmented. They woke when called. They had no control over when rest began or ended. This was not questioned. This was the structure of the world as it existed then. In palaces, In the great residences of rulers, night brought a different quality of vigilance. Guards stood watch in courtyards, in hallways, outside the chambers where power slept. They rotated in shifts, some sleeping while others remained alert, ensuring that the night was never left unattended. Inside the ruler's chamber, lamps burned through the entire night. Multiple lamps placed at intervals, keeping shadows at bay. This was both practical and symbolic, a demonstration that darkness could be held back, that those with enough resources need not submit fully to night's limitations. But even here, even in spaces designed to resist darkness, sleep followed ancient patterns. The body grew heavy. The mind released its hold on waking concerns, and rest arrived. Regardless of how many lamps burned, regardless of how much light pushed against the dark, a slow breath, allowing silence to settle across all these places, cities and villages, palaces and simple homes. Night performed the same function. It was the pause between days, the space where the body recovered from effort, where the mind drifted free from the demands of survival, of work, of constant attention. People did not think of sleep as something mysterious. It was as ordinary as eating, as breathing. You grew tired, you lay down, you closed your eyes. The world continued around you, but you withdrew from it for a time. And this was natural, expected, necessary. The darkness that surrounded sleep was not feared. It was simply the condition of night, the absence of the sun, the time when vision narrowed and other senses, hearing, touch, the internal sense of one's own body, became more prominent. And when morning came, when light returned and people rose to begin another day, the night was not remembered in detail. It faded as nights do, leaving only the restoration it had provided, the rest that made continued living possible. Time moved forward, as it always does. Generations passed. Cities grew larger, then declined, then were built anew. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. Tools improved. Knowledge accumulated and was lost and was rediscovered. But night remained night, and sleep remained sleep. In quieter times, in smaller towns that grew up along trade routes or around monasteries, or in valleys where the land was good for farming, people continued to sleep as their ancestors had, close to one another, in rhythm with darkness, without the complexity that would come later, in ages still distant, still unimaginable. In villages built of stone and timber, night arrived with the ringing of bells, church bells, calling across fields and narrow streets, marking the hour when work should cease. Not a precise hour. There were no clocks in most places, no exact measurements, but a general time agreed upon when daylight had faded enough that labor became difficult. When it made sense to return home, people heard the bells and began to move inward from fields, from workshops, from the edges of the village where animals grazed. They walked slowly, unhurried. There was no reason to rush. The night would wait. Homes were small, one room, sometimes two, walls of stone or wattle and daub, woven sticks covered with clay and straw, dried hard, roofs of thatch thick enough to keep out rain, though not always successfully, floors of packed earth covered with rushes in wealthier homes, left bare in poorer ones. A hearth occupied the center of the room or stood against one wall, stone or brick, built to contain fire, with a chimney if the house was well made, or just a hole in the roof if it was not. Smoke rose and escaped mostly. Some lingered, clinging to walls, to the underside of the roof, leaving everything faintly darkened, faintly scented with ash and wood. The fire burned low as evening deepened. It was not allowed to go out completely. Rekindling flame was effort, required flint and steel and patience, or a walk to a neighbor's hearth to borrow coals. Easier to bank the fire carefully, to cover it with ash so it smoldered through the night, so it could be revived in the morning with just a breath and a bit of kindling. The fire's glow provided the only light in many homes, a soft orange wash that barely reached the corners, that left most of the room in shadow. People moved through this dimness with ease, their hands knowing where things were, their feet finding familiar paths across the floor. In homes where candles could be afforded, one might be lit. Tallow, usually. Animal fat rendered and poured into molds, with a wick of twisted fiber running through the center. The candle burned with a yellowish light, and it smelled faintly of the animal it had come from. Sheep, most often, or beef. Tallow candles sputtered. They smoked. They needed their wicks trimmed regularly, or they would gutter and die. But they were cheaper than beeswax, which burned clean and bright and steady, which was reserved for churches, for the wealthy, for occasions that required something better than everyday light. A single candle did not illuminate much, just a small circle, enough to see faces, to continue some task that required attention, mending a tear in fabric, sharpening a tool, preparing something for the next day. But mostly, once night had fully arrived, work ceased. There was no point in straining eyes in poor light. Better to rest, to sit near the fire, to speak quietly if there was anything to say, to prepare for sleep. Families gathered in the same room where they had cooked, where they had eaten, where they had spent the day when weather kept them indoors. And now that room became the place where they slept. Mattresses were simple, sacks of rough cloth stuffed with straw, with chaff, with dried heather or moss. whatever could be gathered and would provide some softness between body and floor. These mattresses were laid out each night, or sometimes left in place if space allowed. Blankets were wool, homespun and coarse. In winter, multiple blankets, layered. In summer, perhaps just one, or none at all. People slept in the clothes they had worn during the day, or in simpler versions of those clothes, a shift, a tunic. Undressing completely was not common. The night was too cold for that in most seasons. After prayers, they returned to their cells, small rooms, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wooden stool. They lay down again and slept until the next bell called them, until the cycle repeated. This was their discipline, their offering, the rhythm of their lives, unbroken year after year. In the world outside the monastery, most people knew nothing of this schedule. They slept as their bodies required, waking and returning to sleep in their own time, without bells to guide them. In castles in the great stone fortresses, where lords and ladies resided, night brought a different quality of life. The great hall, which had been filled with people during the day, servants moving, dogs wandering, fires burning in massive hearths, grew quieter as evening progressed. Dinner was eaten there at long tables, meat and bread and ale. Candles burned in iron holders, their flames multiplied across the hall, creating more light than most people ever saw in their own homes. But even this light was not bright. It flickered and swayed. Shadows moved constantly across the high ceilings, across the stone walls hung with tapestries. After the meal, after the tables had been cleared, some people remained in the hall to sleep. Servants, mostly, men at arms, those whose status did not grant them private rooms. They spread pallets on the floor, lay down near the fire's warmth, and slept among one another. The lord and lady withdrew to their own chamber, a room separated from the hall by heavy doors, by thick walls. Inside, a bed stood, an actual bed, raised off the ground with a wooden frame and curtains that could be drawn closed to keep out drafts, to create a small enclosed space within the larger room. The bed was draped with fabric, with furs, with layers that provided both warmth and a sense of privacy. When the curtains were drawn, the world contracted to just that small interior. The sounds of the castle faded. The cold was held at bay, slightly, but even here, sleep was not solitary. Servants sometimes slept in the same room, on the floor or on smaller beds. Privacy, as we understand it, was rare, even for the powerful. Candles burned through the night in some parts of the castle, in corridors where guards stood watch, in rooms where someone tended to an illness, or where a birth was taking place, or where some task required continuation into the dark hours. But most of the castle slept. The massive stone structure settled into stillness, its many rooms dark. its many hearths reduced to embers. In the countryside, in the open lands beyond towns and villages, night was darker still. No clusters of homes to create even a small glow. No church towers with lamps burning. Just fields and forests, rivers and hills, all disappearing into blackness when the sun withdrew. Shepherds sometimes stayed out through the night, watching over their flocks. They built small fires and sat beside them, wrapped in cloaks, listening to the sounds of animals shifting, of wind moving through grass. The sheep were pale shapes in the darkness, visible only faintly. The dog, if there was one, stayed close to the fire, alert to any movement beyond the light's reach. Hours passed slowly. The shepherd did not sleep, or slept only lightly, in brief moments when exhaustion overtook vigilance. Mostly he remained awake, aware, waiting for dawn. In forests, where travelers sometimes took shelter, night was a time of stillness. Trees rose up as dark columns, their branches forming a canopy that blocked even starlight. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, with moss, with the accumulation of years. If you slept in such a place, you slept lightly. Every sound, a branch cracking, an animal moving, the rustle of something unseen, pulled you toward waking. But if nothing threatened, if the night remained peaceful, sleep returned, and the hours passed unmarked, unmeasured. Across all these places, in villages and towns, in castles and countryside, night performed its quiet work. It separated one day from the next. It gave the body time to rest, to recover, to prepare for the labor that would begin again with daylight. People did not question this rhythm. They did not resist it. When darkness came, you ceased your work. When your body grew heavy, you lay down. When sleep arrived, you accepted it. And if you woke in the night, you simply waited, calm and still, until sleep returned. There was no anxiety around this, no sense that sleep should be different, should be better, should last uninterrupted from dusk until dawn. Sleep was what it was, a natural cycle shaped by darkness, by the body's needs, by the absence of any reason to remain awake. Once the sun had set, candles and firelight extended the day slightly. They allowed some continuation of activity into the early evening, but they were limited, rationed, never abundant enough to truly banish darkness. And so darkness remained powerful. It shaped when people slept, how they moved through their homes, what tasks could be attempted, and what tasks had to wait for morning. No one fought against this. It was simply the condition of life. Slowly, across generations, things began to shift. Not suddenly, not in ways that any single person would have noticed, but over time, as methods improved, as resources became slightly more available, the night began to change. More candles in some places, oil lamps that burned more steadily than tallow, glass windows, rare but growing more common, that allowed light to pass through without letting in cold. Towns grew larger, streets became more defined, and in some of those streets, in the busiest areas, lanterns began to appear. Not everywhere, not in most places, but here and there, a light hung outside a building, left burning through part of the night, creating small islands of visibility in the darkness. These changes were gradual, almost imperceptible, but they were there, quiet as the night itself, slowly altering the relationship between light and dark, between waking and sleeping, between the hours that belong to work and the hours that belong to rest. And the night, ancient and patient, absorbed these changes without resistance, continuing its slow turn toward dawn, as it always had, as it always would. In time, the night began to change in ways that had never been possible before. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, steadily, across years and then decades. The darkness that had governed human life for so long began to retreat. It started with gas lamps. In cities, along certain streets, tall posts were erected, iron pool posts fixed into the ground, rising above the height of a person. At the top of each post, a glass enclosed flame, not a candle flame, not oil, gas piped through underground lines, released at a controlled rate, burning steadily through the hours of the darkness. A lamplighter walked the streets at dusk. He carried a long pole with a flame at its end, and he touched this flame to each lamp in sequence, one after another, moving down the street in a slow procession. The lamps caught, flared, settled into steady glows, and the street, which would have been completely dark, was now visible, not brightly lit, not the way we think of street lighting now. The pools of light were modest, separated by stretches of shadow, but they were there, consistent, reliable. For the first time, night in the city was not entirely governed by darkness. You could walk at night and see where you were going. You could move from one lamp to the next, using them as guides, as markers. This changed things, quietly. People began to stay out later. Shops remained open a little longer. The boundary between day and night softened, became less absolute. Inside homes, gaslighting arrived as well. Fixtures mounted on walls, connected to the same lines that fed the street lamps. You turned a valve, and gas flowed. You lit it, and the room filled with light, more light than candles had ever provided, steadier, less smoky. The flicker was gone. The flame still moved, slightly, but it was controlled, enclosed, directed upward into glass shades that diffused and softened the glow. Rooms became brighter in the evening. Tasks that had been difficult by candlelight, reading, sewing, detailed work, became easier. The day extended further into what had once been night's domain, but gas lamps still required flame. They still relied on something burning, and flame, no matter how controlled, carried risk. Leaks could fill a room with gas. A careless moment could lead to fire. And so, in time, something else arrived: electric light. At first, it appeared in public places, in theaters, in hotels, in the grand buildings where wealth and innovation converged. Bulbs of glass with filaments inside, glowing when current passed through them. No flame, no smoke, just light, clean and steady, and unlike anything that had come before. The light was harsh initially, too bright, too white. It lacked the warmth of firelight, the softness of candles, but it was powerful. It illuminated completely. Shadows were pushed into corners, into the edges where light could not quite reach. Gradually, electric light spread from public buildings to homes, from cities to towns. Wires were strung, poles erected, power stations built. The infrastructure required was enormous, complex, but it grew year by year until electric light was no longer rare, no longer reserved for the wealthy. You flipped a switch, and the room filled with light, instant, effortless. No matches, no wicks, no waiting for flame to catch. Night, inside homes, became optional. You could work late if you needed to. You could read without straining. You could see clearly as daylight, whenever you chose. And people did choose. They stayed awake longer. They filled the evening hours with activity that had once been impossible. The boundary between day and night blurred further. Outside, cities began to glow, street after street lit with electric lamps, brighter than gas had ever been. Buildings illuminated, their windows shining, signs made of light, flashing, advertising, drawing the eye. From a distance, at night, a city became visible in a way it never had been before. A cluster of light against the darkness, a constellation brought down to earth. The night sky, which had always been filled with stars, grew harder to see. The light from below rose upward, scattering in the atmosphere, creating a glow that obscured the faint points of distant stars. Only the brightest remained visible: planets, a few major stars, the moon. But most people did not notice this loss. They were looking at the light around them, at the streets and buildings, at the new brightness that made night navigable, familiar, less formidable. Sleep during this time began to shift as well. For generations, people had slept when darkness arrived and woken when light returned. But now, darkness did not arrive in the same way. It was held back by lamps, by electric light, by the glow of a city that never fully dimmed. And time itself became more structured. Clocks had existed before, of course. Sundials, water clocks, mechanical clocks in church towers, but they had not governed daily life the way they came to govern it now. Factories required precision. Workers needed to arrive at the same time, work for measured hours, leave at designated moments. Trains ran on schedules. Businesses operated within set hours. Time was divided, parceled out, assigned. And sleep, which had once been flexible, which had followed the body's rhythms and the absence of light, became something to be managed. You went to bed at a certain time because you needed to wake at a certain time, because the factory whistle blew at dawn, or because the train left at a specific hour, or because your work demanded presence at a moment that did not bend to accommodate rest. The alarm clock became common, a mechanical device, spring driven, that rang at a set time. It woke you regardless of whether your body was ready, regardless of how deeply you had been sleeping. People began to speak of getting enough sleep, of needing a certain number of hours. The night, which had once been long and unmarked, became something to be measured, calculated, optimized. But the body's rhythms did not change as quickly as the structures around it. The body still responded to darkness, still produced the chemicals that signaled rest when light faded. It still wanted to wake gradually, gently, in response to the slow return of daylight. But now, darkness did not arrive fully. Rooms remained lit until the moment someone chose to turn off the lights. And morning arrived not with the sun's slow rise, but with the sharp sound of an alarm, the sudden demand to wake, to move, to begin. Sleep became something people struggled with. Not everyone, not all the time, but more frequently than before. People found themselves lying awake at night, unable to fall asleep despite being tired, or waking in the middle of the night and finding that sleep would not return easily. The long, segmented sleep of earlier times, the pattern of waking in the deep night and then sleeping again, began to be seen as disruption rather than normal. People expected sleep to be continuous, unbroken. When it was not, they worried. Remedies appeared, tonics, medicines, advice, some helpful, some not. The idea that sleep could be fixed, controlled, managed, took root. But beneath all of this, the body's ancient patterns persisted. The pull toward rest when darkness came, the gradual winding down of alertness as the day wore on, the deep, restorative quality of sleep that arrived naturally, without force. These patterns were still there. They had not disappeared. They were simply harder to hear, harder to follow. In a world that had grown bright and loud and structured in ways that did not always align with the rhythms the body carried, a gentle pause, soft and unforced, in homes, bedrooms became separate spaces. Not in all homes, not immediately, but over time, as buildings were designed with more rooms, as privacy became something valued and pursued, sleep moved into its own designated area, a bedroom, a room used only or primarily for sleeping, a bed that was not folded away each morning, not shared with the entire household, a door that could be closed. This was luxury initially, but gradually it became standard, expected. Each person ideally had their own bed, children in one room, parents in another, space between sleep and waking life. The bedroom was kept dark or darkened with curtains, quiet or as quiet as the world outside allowed, a retreat from the brightness and noise of the rest of the home. Mattresses improved, springs, padding, materials designed for comfort rather than mere function. Pillows multiplied, blankets became softer, lighter, more varied. Sleep became an experience to be cultivated, refined. The bed was not just a place to collapse at the end of the day, but something to be considered, improved, made as comfortable as possible. And yet, despite all this attention, despite the comfort and the privacy and the control over light and sound, sleep remained elusive for many. The mind, even when the body was ready to rest, often continued its work. Thoughts circled, replayed the day's events, anticipated the next day's demands. Worries surfaced in the quiet, in the stillness that sleep required. People lay in the dark, in rooms designed for rest, and found themselves awake, not because they wanted to be, but because the mind would not release its hold. This was not new. People had always known sleepless nights, but now there was a sense that it should not be this way, that sleep should come easily, that the bedroom and the bed and the controlled environment should be enough. When it was not enough, frustration grew, and frustration made sleep even harder to find. A slow breath, allowing space, night continued to change. Televisions appeared in homes, glowing screens watched in the evening, extending wakefulness further. The light from the screen was bright, blue tone, different from the warm glow of incandescent bulbs. It signaled alertness to the brain, even as the body grew tired. People watched late into the night, not always because the programs were compelling, but because the screen was there, because it filled time, because it delayed the moment of turning everything off and lying in the dark. Computers arrived, at first in offices, then in homes. Screens that glowed, that required attention, that made the evening hours productive in new ways. Work that had once ended when you left the office could now continue at home, late into the night. The boundary between work and rest dissolved further. And then smaller screens, phones that fit in a pocket, that went everywhere, that never truly turned off. Screens that could be checked at any moment, that brought the world into the bedroom, into the last minutes before sleep, into the middle of the night if you woke and reached for them. The light from these screens was intense, close to the eyes, impossible to ignore. The information they carried, messages, news, images, endless streams of content, demanded attention, pulled the mind away from the quietness sleep required. People began to sleep with their phones beside the bed, within reach, and when sleep was slow to arrive, or when they woke in the night, they reached for the phone almost reflexively. A few minutes of scrolling, a quick check of messages, just enough to fully wake the mind, to make returning to sleep more difficult. This became common, normal, unremarked upon. The night, which had once been a time of disconnection from the world, became continuous with the day. The same information, the same demands, the same stimulation available at any hour. And sleep, which required a letting go, a withdrawal from engagement, became harder to claim. But the body, patient as always, continued its quiet work. Even in the brightest cities, even in homes filled with screens and light and noise, the body still knew what it needed. When true darkness arrived, when the lights were finally turned off, when the screens were set aside, when the room fell into stillness, the body responded. The heart rate slowed, breathing deepened, muscles released tension they had been holding. The mind, if allowed, began to drift, to loosen its grip on the specific and the immediate. And sleep, when it came, was still the same sleep humans had always known, restorative, necessary, a state in which the body repaired itself, in which memories were processed, in which the systems that sustain life performed their essential maintenance. No amount of light or noise or structure could change what sleep fundamentally was. It remained an ancient process, a rhythm carried in every cell, a need as basic as breathing. People who honored that need, who allowed darkness, who let go of the day's concerns, who gave their bodies time and quiet and stillness, found that sleep arrived as it always had, not always perfectly, not always easily, but eventually, reliably, if the conditions allowed. And in those hours of sleep, regardless of what century they occurred in, regardless of whether the world outside was lit by fire or electricity or the glow of 1,000 screens, the same restoration took place. The same dreams flickered through the mind. The same cycles of deep and light sleep repeated through the night. The same slow return to waking as morning approached. Sleep had not changed, only the context surrounding it. In some places, even now, night still resembles the night humans knew for thousands of years. In remote areas, far from cities, in places where electricity has not yet reached, or where it is used sparingly, in deserts, in mountains, in forests that remain undisturbed. There, when the sun sets, darkness arrives completely. The sky fills with stars, uncountable, stretching from horizon to horizon. The air grows cool, Sounds change. Daytime birds fall silent. Nighttime creatures begin to move. People in those places still sleep in rhythm with darkness. They lie down when there is no light to see by, and they wake when the first glow of dawn touches the sky. Their sleep follows the old patterns. It comes in waves. They wake sometimes in the deep night, lie quietly for a time, then sleep again. They do not worry about this. It is simply how night unfolds. And in the morning, they rise without alarm, their bodies ready, their rest complete. Perhaps sleep is not something to be solved. Perhaps it is something to be allowed. The body knows what it needs. It has always known. For as long as humans have existed, the body has guided itself toward rest when rest was required. Darkness helps. Stillness helps. The absence of demands, of stimulation, of light that signals alertness. But even without perfect conditions, sleep finds its way. You lie down, you close your eyes, you let the day fall away, bit by bit, thought by thought, and eventually, without deciding to, without forcing it, you drift. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurs. The mind softens, the body grows heavy, and sleep arrives as it always has, quiet, necessary, complete. The words slow further, becoming more spacious. The night is long. There is time. There has always been time. The darkness holds you the way it has held every person who has ever lived. And in that darkness, in that stillness, the body does what it has always done. It rests, it restores, it prepares for another day. But that day is not here yet. Right now, there is only this: the quiet, the dark, the soft, steady rhythm of breath, in and out, in and out. Nothing to do, nothing to remember, just this moment and the next and the one after that. Slow, steady, soft. The night continues. It always continues. And somewhere within it, held gently, safely, you rest.